Hi, my name is Garcia, and today I want to talk to you about America's loss of its young soldiers in its war on drugs. This is about a study of adolescent drug abuse in Hillsborough County. I was motivated to conduct this research due to a narcotics overdose prevention and education presentation that was given at my school. This was last September, and the effects that I saw on the student body at my school, faculty, teachers, and members of the community at large um, showed me the importance of this topic and how it affected our community. The vivid examples of preventable deaths due to overdoses, and the clear testimony of parents of victims, and the touching examples that we saw of high schoolers dying all around us really impacted me, and the effect this had on other students in Gaither High School showed the importance of this topic. So I decided to follow this topic and study it. So I decided to do a study on the following research question. What are the greatest factors that contribute most to teenage drug abuse in Gaither High School as a representative population of adolescents in Hillsborough County? I hypothesized that within the context of the famous nature versus nurture debate, the environmental factors, that is those that are related to nurture, those that are around the student, have a greater impact as opposed to those related to nature, or which can be classified as socioeconomic background, race, ethnicity. And those external factors, those as part of the nurture debate, are more to blame for the drug epidemic among teenagers in Hillsborough County. I assume that these external influences of the environment will be more influential than their intrinsic natural dispositions. So this is what I set out to test. Now, the issues with drugs are not just contained in our community, in our county, or even in our nation. These are global issues. And according to this report by the United Nations, around 247 million people in our planet use drugs. That accounts to 5.2% of the population in our planet. Now, this data is as recent as 2014, and yet we see an increase in this curve, which shows that more and more people are using drugs each year. Considering that this trend continues to hold true, the data for 2017 and 18 should be much greater than the 247 million people worldwide who use drugs. And this is a very alarming figure. Now, there are tremendous health costs that come with the use of drugs. For example, and there is even more, a correlation between a country's level of development and how it's affected by drugs. For example, the United States, which is a very developed country, is highly affected by this. As we see in that graph right there, countries of low or medium development do not have such a high burden of drug use disorders, whereas high and very high countries in this Human Development Index, which is also produced by the United Nations, those are the countries that are most affected by this. And the United States is a very, very highly developed country. So this touches very close to us. And our wealth and our consumerist culture make us a prime target for the drug market, especially due to this circumstance. We also see that there are certain trends that account for drug consumption of different kinds of drugs, from legal to illegal substances. And for example, it is interesting to see a drug like cocaine over there to the top right is correlated to higher income levels. So the higher income level, the more likely you are to use cocaine. Whereas another drugs such as amphetamines are more equally distributed throughout economic levels. So more people have access to it. And this is an important thing to take into consideration when we target the kinds of drugs that make their way to our schools and to our adolescents, our students. So the war on drugs in the United States has had a very long history, and quite honestly an ineffective one. Since 1971, when President Nixon declared the war on drugs, we have had enormous investments of capital and efforts to try to deal with this problem, and we have not succeeded in conquering it. Even though drugs were public enemy number one over 40 years ago, they have not been eradicated from our society. And this in part has been blamed on ulterior motives such as racial segregation and political alienation, which are claimed to have been the main focus of these campaigns. And this could be seen in different kinds of sentences that offenders will receive if they were caught with different drugs, which were specific to ethnic communities or racial communities. For example, African Americans were more likely to consume a drug like crack, and that was more highly penalized than the drugs that were used by Anglo Americans. In the United States, the human costs, which should be the ones that we pay the most attention to, especially when it comes to this topic of teenagers, are on the rise. The amount of deaths in our country has been on the rise, while especially in high proportion in these last few years, from 2015 to 17. It's a great increase. And these causes are very diverse, and they don't depend on just one drug. There are varieties of drugs that contribute to this. But the alarming thing is that in 2016, for example, there were over 64,000 deaths just from overdoses. And this may overshadow the fact that we have to deal with addiction, people who have to struggle with this problem for the rest of their lives. That we also have to deal with the consequences to our economy and to just the lives of all of those people around those affected by this epidemic. This problem, as I said before, has been increasing recently, and we can see that the diversity of the drugs used by addicts and recreational users it's tremendous. For example, the synthetic opioid use which are other than methadone, we have over 20,000 overdose deaths for the year 2016. We have over 15,000 heroin deaths. We have over 14,000 deaths from other opioids. And this data is truly alarming due to the diversity of these drugs. That even if you believe you can avoid one, or our students believe that they can avoid one which is more dangerous, we see here that all of these pose a threat of an overdose. Now, these types of drugs involved, as I mentioned before, are many different kinds. But what is important to notice is that
this is just a reminder.
recently
the PTA meeting will
we
be
have
at
seen
2:15
an
in the
increase
principal's
not
conference room.
only
Thank you.
in non-prescription drugs, but also the use of prescription drugs and the risk for overdose. And this can be seen all over these graphs, for example. Play the timer. And in what relates to economic costs, in 2007, for example, the estimated economic cost of drug abuse in our country was $193 billion. Now, 11 years later, we can definitely say that the digits have increased. Now, back then, for example, our country lost $120 billion in lost productivity, $11 billion in healthcare costs, and $61 billion in criminal justice costs. Now, these are alarming figures for sure. And the costs today, as I mentioned before, are much higher. And as a famous Princeton economist, Alan Kruger, stated, as many as 1 out of 5 American men drop out of the labor market due to drugs. Now, when it comes to teenagers, which is the focus of my study, data is harder to come by. But yet, that which is gathered is extremely strong, because it indicates how these young kids who have their whole futures ahead of them succumb to drugs, and so many of their dreams are unrealized. For example, in this data, which shows overdoses for ages 15 to 24, and the number of deaths in 2015, we see that there are a total of 4,235 deaths of these young kids. That males are more than twice as likely to experience an overdose, as there are 2,977 of them who have fallen victim to these drugs, while only 1,258 ladies in comparison have died. And these are both alarming figures. And now we see illegal drugs such as cocaine and heroin, but it is also important to notice that prescription drugs are very high in this ranking, and there are over 1,300 or 1,500 deaths by combined use of benzodiazepines and common prescription opioids or pain relievers due to addiction. Now, in the United States, there has been this ongoing research called the Monitoring the Future Survey, which has been around since 1975, and it has been tracking the use of illegal drugs by teenagers throughout our history. And as we see in that graph over there, currently we see record low levels of many drugs and substances. This is not only contained to drugs. For example, there are also record low levels of alcohol and cigarette consumption. But more importantly, for the scope of this research, prescription opioids, heroines, and other drugs are also at historic lows, which seems like a good result. Yet, although the percentages of kids are lower, we have a higher number of kids who are, we still have a very high number of kids who are partaking in this. So our problem is far from being resolved. So from 1999 to 2015, the amount of overdoses among teenagers in our country more than doubled in our entire country. Although percentages of drug use are lower, the total numbers are much higher. So in order to research this, in order to investigate this issue, a descriptive research method was adopted. And I attempted to study the phenomenon just as it was. I followed the strategies of a conceptual theorist. In my approach, I looked to establish large-scale correlations, and I conducted surveys to gather both quantitative and qualitative data. In order to gather this data, a statistically significant sample of quantitative data from the population, a survey was delivered to seniors of the age of 18 at Gaither High School, and the participants were assured of their anonymity as to ensure more accurate results, so they could be more frank about their responses. On average, students believe that 57.93% of the students at their school consume drugs, and these estimates had a range from 5 to 90%. The results, moreover, of a series of questions which asked students to rank certain factors such as socioeconomic background, peer influence, school stress, family stress, on a scale from 1 being the lowest level of influence to 10 being the highest level of influence on drug consumption by adolescents, yielded these results, in which we see that peer influence has the highest ranking, followed by family stress, and then school stress. And these serve to support my hypothesis that external influences and factors were more important than intrinsic factors such as race and ethnicity, which students ranked lower in the importance that it should have when considering the propensity of students to fall victim to drugs. So, the external influences, as I said before, the peer influence, family stress, and parenting styles were consistently higher ranked by students than race, ethnicity, and socioeconomic background. The studies show the belief in a sample of students that factors in the environment of adolescents have the greatest impact in determining drug abuse. Now, I also conducted I asked different questions for the students in hypothetical situations and asking what they would do. So, for example, when they were asked if they witnessed a friend struggling with substance abuse, what would they do? 4% would let them work it out on their own, let the friend figure it out. 22% said they would notify the authorities, and that's important to notice, only 22%. Now, at 64%, students who said they would help out personally and do what they can personally were the majority. And then 10% said they would do something else, like an intervention, acknowledge the issue, and this fell in the category very close to helping out personally. Now, it is important to notice that since most of these students are saying they would like to help out personally, we need to furnish these students with the abilities to help out personally, or to reach out to them and to convince them that we need to contact the authorities, the people that are qualified to deal with these issues. Because only 22% of students say they would notify the authorities. Also, when students were asked about the risk of combining substances, and as an effort to address their knowledge of drug use and dangers, only 4% were not aware that combining substances led to higher risk of overdose, which is a good result since we know that 96% of students would be aware that combining substances would be a risk. 26%, however, did not know about the Good Samaritan laws. That is the law which allows people who see in events of an overdose, see someone at risk to their health, and they can act upon that. They can call the police and interfere without risk of them being penalized. However, 98% of respondents claim that they would make the call and notify the authorities in case they witness an overdose, and this is a great statistic because we see the willingness of these students to help out their peers. Now, this study was limited in certain regards. For example, both qualitative, even though both qualitative and quantitative data was gathered, neither sample was randomly selected. That's the weakness of the study. And therefore, the results cannot be extrapolated and applied to a larger population. The sample sizes was small. It was a convenient sample which had to be used. And upon reflection, these may not be the most representative students, since many were taken from my classes. They were all AP students, and they differ from the general student body. However, these are well documented part of the population, some of the highest achieving students. So we can use their input as a way to maybe contrast to future research. In conclusion, although the prevalence of and use of certain drugs in our country has decreased among teenagers, we are still far from our goal. The fact that students estimate that almost 58% of adolescents at their school consume drugs is alarming, because this may lead them to consume drugs themselves in the future. However, students are well informed of the risks about combining drugs. 96% know about this. However, we need more education about drug policies, because 26% of students were uninformed about good Samaritan laws. And overall, environmental factors were higher ranked than racial, ethnic, and socioeconomic characteristics as factors contributing to drug abuse. And this is important because it allows us to focus on the things that really make a difference in the lives of these students and help us prevent the unfortunate event of them falling victims to drug abuse. And as suggestions and future directions for other studies, it's important to notice that there are many gaps in our understanding of the real amount of students that consume drugs in our school, as well as our education about topics such as combining drugs and use of Samaritan laws. I believe that research should be conducted to elucidate on this field and to have a greater understanding of our youth. And it will be great significance to study different age groups and to find correlations between their substance habits and their educations on these topics. And these are some of the sources that I use. My name is Garcia, and thank you very much.